reducing solitary confinement, but eliminating it specifically for people who are mentally ill. She's been married for 36 years, I believe, and she's a mom, and she has a grandchild, and she's been stepped up and pulled together organizations like SALT and the Interfaith Action for Human Rights and others into a coalition to work on this issue of solitary confinement. Okay, you gotta. I was gonna ask if you have a mic over there.
Thank you, John. Boy, Sister Simone and this is on. You're on. Okay. Sister Simone and Delegate Plum are
Up close.
tough acts to follow. Is that better? No.
Turned it off.
Okay, how about now? Okay, sorry about that. Thank you very much, John. I have to say I was a little surprised and very humbled to find myself on the same program as the other illustrious speakers here today. And I apologize, I'm having some trouble with my voice as well. When John first asked me if I'd be able to attend the conference today, I had no idea he was intending to add me to the list of featured speakers. I know people say this all the time, but I'm truly honored to be here. I was especially pleased that the theme of this conference is solidarity with vulnerable Virginians. One thing that brings us together at events like this is that many of us approach social justice advocacy from a faith-based perspective. We come from different faiths and denominations, but as people of faith, we feel a special responsibility to stand with those in our society who are the most vulnerable. In the eyes of God, no one is disposable, no matter who they are, where they come from, what they look like, or what they have done. We are called to honor and defend the dignity of every person. And in all my years in the human rights movement, I have never felt our work was more important or more urgently needed than it is right now. What I want to talk to you about today is the work of my organization, Interfaith Action for Human Rights, and its coalition partners in Virginia to shine a light on Virginia's use of solitary confinement in its prisons and jails, and abuse of treatment associated with isolation, and to share with you how we are advocating for change. IAHR is an interfaith nonprofit organization in Virginia, Maryland, and DC that grew out of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, or NERCAT. NERCAT's initial focus was opposing the use of torture and indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay and CIA black sites in the aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks. Prolonged solitary confinement was a key element of psychologically breaking those detainees. It didn't take long for NERCAT to decide that if it was serious about opposing US-sponsored torture, it needed to also address torture in US prisons, particularly prolonged solitary confinement. IAHR was later formed as an independent nonprofit by members of NERCAT who lived in DC, Virginia, and Maryland. We have continued working on solitary confinement, focusing on prisons and jails in the Mid-Atlantic region. Now, it's worth noting that the vocabulary around this practice is ever-changing. Prison officials usually don't admit to using solitary confinement. Instead, they call it segregation or restrictive housing or special housing or some other euphemism. But it boils down to confining a person to a closet-sized cell for 22 to 24 hours a day. There is compelling evidence that isolation in excess of 15 consecutive days damages mental health in people who were previously healthy, exacerbates pre-existing mental health issues, and can even permanently alter brain chemistry. Consequently, a 15-day limit on solitary confinement is now embedded in international human rights norms. The United Nations standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners say that no one should be kept in isolation for longer than 15 consecutive days. Now, other states are adopting limits on the use of isolation. In Maine, for example, no one can be placed in isolation for longer than 72 hours without the personal approval of the Commissioner of Corrections. Texas, within the last 2 months, ended the use of solitary confinement as punishment for disciplinary infractions. And Colorado has completely abolished isolated confinement for people with serious mental illness and limits solitary confinement for others to 15 days. When we started this work about 3 years ago, I knew nothing about how Virginia was using isolated confinement. I had seen a presentation by the Department of Corrections about its step-down program, which was instituted in 2012 to enable men in solitary at Red Onion and Wallens Ridge prisons in Southwest Virginia to transition to the general prison population. And it sounded impressive. Certainly the numbers the department cites of men who have gone through the program and transitioned out of isolation are significant. And there are success stories, no doubt about it. But I wanted to know more. I wanted to hear directly from prisoners and their families, if I could, about what they thought of Virginia's step-down program. It took me a while, but eventually I was able to establish contact with 2 or 3 men who were in solitary confinement at Red Onion and Wallens Ridge. And over time, I started learning about more men who had been in prolonged isolation. My correspondence grew so that by now I have corresponded to varying degrees with 50 to 60 men at those 2 prisons and a few at other prisons. Obviously, we can't go into the prisons and conduct our own independent investigation, but nevertheless, there are a few things I can say for sure that we know. First, we know there are men who have mental illness who are in prolonged, indefinite solitary confinement in Virginia. In some cases, symptoms first appeared sometime after they had been in isolation. In other cases, existing symptoms were exacerbated by prolonged isolation. But whatever the sequence, this should never happen. Isolation is almost guaranteed to make mental illness worse. We know from scientific studies that it can result in permanent neurological damage. Second, Virginia continues to use indefinite isolation in circumstances in which it is not necessary in order to ensure the security of the prison and protect the safety of inmates and staff. And I can give some examples of what I mean by that in the question and answer period if you're curious. Third, there is very little transparency or communication with prisoners and their family members about why they are placed in segregation or how long they will remain there. And there's no meaningful way for them to challenge decisions about their housing. The indefinite nature of segregation compounds its stressfulness. Moreover, inmates are sometimes forced to repeat the step-down program multiple times or held back within the program for reasons that are unknown to them, are never explained, and appear arbitrary. For prisoners in long-term segregation, there are status rating charts that are used to record prisoners' ratings in various behavioral categories for the purpose of making decisions about their advancement or regression within the step-down program. These categories include things like keeping their cell neat, standing for count, maintaining good grooming and hygiene, and showing respect. If they get a certain number of negative ratings in these categories within a 90-day or 6-month review period, they can be held back in the program or forced to repeat the program. This is true even if they have committed no disciplinary infractions. But they are not shown their status rating charts and are usually not told specifically why they are being held back. I've been particularly struck by the failure to engage family members where possible in the effort to rehabilitate and prepare these prisoners to leave isolation and ultimately to re-enter society. I've talked to family members who have been essentially stonewalled in their dogged efforts to understand what is happening to their loved ones in prison. One of the key objectives of the Step Down program is to foster a sense of responsibility on the part of the prisoners to their families. But the men we've heard from often feel keenly that almost everything about their actual experience in prison undermines their connections to their families. Most families live too far away from these prisons to visit these men. Even if they do visit, they are not allowed to touch their loved ones, as the prisoners are behind screens and are shackled during visits. Their phone privileges are extremely limited. And current restrictions on mail mean that, as a practical matter, it's impossible to send greeting cards, photographs, or children's drawings to prisoners. All of this engenders cynicism in many of the men about the content of the Step Down program curriculum. Certainly, keeping prisoners in the dark and failing to engage their family members as partners in their rehabilitation serves no one's interests. Another serious problem affects those who are classified as the worst of the worst. In Virginia, these men are designated IM, which stands for Intensive Management. These individuals are generally not allowed ever to transition out of isolation, even after completing the Step Down program. So they are essentially in permanent isolation. These are some of the problems that we believe need to be solved, because we know it is extremely harmful to keep people in prolonged isolation. And we all have a stake in this, because most of these men are going to be released from prison at some point. We are seriously undermining their capacity to reintegrate in society as healthy and responsible citizens when they get out. So what are we doing about all of this? Well, IHR formed a coalition with other concerned individuals and organizations, including SALT, Virginia Cure, the ACLU, and the Virginia Council of Churches. Together, we've met with the head of the Department of Corrections and his executive staff. We sent a delegation to visit Red Onion Prison. We've met with Governor McAuliffe's senior advisors, and we're trying to educate the public and legislators about the problems we're learning about. In a small number of individual cases, we've been able to make a difference by intervening on their behalf, but mostly we're looking at how we can affect systemic change. We're currently considering the possibility of pursuing legislation to place limits on the use of isolated confinement, and we want to learn more about the use of isolation in local and regional jails. But we need help, so please let me know if you're interested in participating in our work, or if you know of other organizations that might want to join our coalition. We also sponsor a pen pal project in which we connect prisoners with people on the outside who want to help ease their isolation and loneliness. So I'd be pleased to provide information about that if you'd like to know more. And I'd like to close by sharing a brief portion of a letter I recently received from a woman whose son has spent the last 6 years in solitary confinement at Red Onion Prison. She writes, "It will be 6 years this October. My son is not the same person he was when he went in. I don't know who's done that to him. But all I can tell you is that he's lost his mind. I can't get a conversation out of him anymore. He speaks a language that no one understands. He speaks in numbers, and he growls as if he's not human, like as if the devil himself jumped inside his body. My family and I just came back from seeing him. His hair has grown nappy and out of control all over his face and head. His teeth are so yellow and filled with decay. His clothes are so dirty and big that they are falling off of him. He looks like he only weighs 98 pounds. He came into prison so healthy. It seems to me as if they just put him in a hole and just left him there.